And all the time I knew Kurt, he never ever talked about having ambition to be a rock star. He never predicted that he was going to be a big rock star.
I didn't think it would be with music. I thought it would be with art. He could have made it with art. He was that talented at drawing.
There were times, I think, when he felt satisfied when he'd written a song and people liked it and it went to the top of the charts. But I don't know that he ever enjoyed life. I mean, I think there is a pall of depression that hangs over most of Kurt's life.
In 1991, Nirvana exploded onto the world stage with the single Smells Like Teen Spirit and album Nevermind. The band became an instant household name, and their enigmatic frontman, Kurt Cobain, became the face of the new Seattle grunge scene. This is the story of Kurt Cobain, a man obsessed by his past and pinned to the memories of a difficult childhood. The early years of an unlikely rock icon. Donald Cobain was born on the 20th of February 1967 in Grays Harbor Community Hospital, overlooking the northwest town of Aberdeen, a town that Cobain would call home for most of his life.
Well, one of the interesting things about Aberdeen is it's one of the only cities on the west coast of America that has actually lost population over the last 100 years. At the turn of the century, it was a booming town, and it was booming because primarily the fishing industry was big, the logging industry, and the natural resources. By the time Kurt was born, those jobs were going away, and the unemployment rate was one of the highest in Washington.
It's always been a hard luck town. It's always been a town where you had to scrabble to make it, and it's never had any luck. Its industry has always been declining. I mean, I've been watching that town's industry decline forever. The city fathers probably would wish that people like I wouldn't point that out, but if you drive through the town, you can see that.
Growing up in Aberdeen at that particular time, what was it, mid-70s, was good. It was good living. It was a good time. There was lots of work. But it's the late 70s is when things kind of went, the logging industry had sanctions imposed upon us. In the mid-80s, the fishing kind of went down, so the economy in Grays Harbor was at a really bad low. So there wasn't a whole lot of high-paying jobs, and that just led to, I think, introductions of kids experimenting with things to get away, whether it be pot, cocaine, or other recreational drugs. Just a form of release to get away from the area, the economy.
And so you had a population there that was basically depressed economically and psychologically. You had angry people, out-of-work people, people hanging out in a dwindling number of taverns and bars downtown, just getting more angry and more frustrated, and there was never any hope on the horizon for that poor town.
Kurt grew up very poor. When he was born, his dad was working at a service station. He was making approximately $5 an hour. And this was not the kind of wage where you could support a family. And they struggled. And throughout his entire youth, his family struggled to pay their bills and pay their mortgage.
In 1969, Kurt's parents, Don and Wendy, bought their first family home on East First Street, Aberdeen. Contrary to the singer's portrayal of his early childhood, the young family had a poor but happy life, with Kurt the centre of his parents' attention.
Growing up in that period, in that part of town, what we would do for entertainment is it was undeveloped land at that time. If you go there now and look at it, there's a lot of development. But that time there was trees, fields, ponds. We lived right next to a river, the Wishkah River. We'd swim in there, we'd catch fish in there, play hide and seek, kick the can, have match fights, you know, just being kids. He was a gifted artist, even at an early age. I mean, he can draw anything. His personality was easy to get along with, very easy to get along with. Good sense of humor, you know, just having fun, you know, being kids.
You know, my analysis is the first 10 years of his life, for the most part, were fairly straightforward. He had parents that fought a fair amount, but he's not the only kid to grow up in that environment. He had a sister he loved. He was a very creative kid. He had a larger family that really embraced his creativity. He was a skilled artist even by the time he was in kindergarten.
Kurt was a good little boy. He was very, very happy. Always happy all the time. Beating on drums or something, on kettles, pots and pans. That's what we always thought he'd be, was a drummer, not a guitarist. He's full of the devil. He's always doing something, drawing or something. He was quite an artist. Here's a picture he drew. The way he started these pictures was, he come in the house one day. He was 6 years old, and he come in the house, and he had a picture of Donald Duck that he drew. He says, "Look at Grandpa." He says, "I drew Donald Duck." Or I mean, of Mickey Mouse. He drew Mickey Mouse. And I said, "You didn't draw that. You traced it." He got about half mad, and he says, "You give me some paper, and I'll show you." And so Grandma got him some papers out, and instead of drawing, he says, "I won't draw a Donald," or he says, "I won't draw Mickey Mouse." He says, "I'll draw you Donald Duck," and that's what he done. He was 6 years old then. And then he drew this one here too, Goofy. So I thought them were, I didn't know, my wife had saved them, I didn't know it. But she saved all of his stuff that he had here.
The time that I knew him, times were good. I mean, the family life where, you know, they were still married, you know, a functional family. But then after we grew apart into the middle years, the great junior high school years, is when he went to live in Monty. And obviously things, you know, kind of frazzled out from there. But any broken home, you know, it just depends on, you know, how it's picked up and ran with, you know.
His family life when he was young, I think it sometimes has been painted wrong in that we want to think of it as horrid, his entire existence, and that really wasn't the case. Even Cobain himself said a number of times, "I had a happy childhood," until at the point his parents got divorced.
In 1976, when Kurt was just 9 years old, Wendy Cobain demanded a divorce from Kurt's father, Don. The divorce caught the whole family by surprise and had a devastating impact on the young Kurt.
That really was the most important moment in his childhood. Many of his issues could be traced to that point. He, you know, loved the family together, and the idea of them being split up was something that was very difficult for him to appreciate emotionally. Many kids at that age begin, I think, to understand that, okay, mom and dad don't get along. My sense with Kurt was that it was a personal insult to him, the idea of not having this family together. He was separated from his sister, who he loved. Those things were very, very difficult for him. Initially spent some time with his mother and then moved in with his father into a trailer in Montesano. Now, then things sort of improved. Kurt loved being with his dad. They had a very close relationship. I think at times that relationship gets doctored by things that happened later. But during his early childhood, I think his father was tremendously important to him, and they were very close.
He was, you know, he was hard on Kurt to a point, but I think it was out of love. You know, that's why he was hard on him. And it was obvious. But, you know, for someone to, I'm sure him and his father's problems later on, you know, were about a lot of different things. But his dad was very supportive when he was growing up, and you could tell he wanted to be a part of his life. He was at every Little League baseball game, and a big part of his life at that time, anyway.
They got along beautifully for about the first 6 months after the divorce, because Don was taking Kurt to ball games and fishing and stuff that way, camping and stuff, and they got along beautifully. But after he got married, all that stopped. And I guess Kurt just didn't, I guess he just wanted to be the centerpiece, and he wasn't anymore.
His father eventually met this woman and married her, and she had 3 children of her own. And Kurt suddenly had step brothers and sisters in his house, and that created a great difficulty for him. He was used to being the center of attention in this family. Throughout his whole life, he had really been the center of attention. Even when his sister was born, it was still the Kurt show. And having a stepmother and stepbrothers and sisters, he forever felt alienated and isolated, I think, from that point on. His stepmother, Kurt wrote some nasty things about her and said some nasty things about her. Having met her and talked to her extensively, my sense was that he demonized her. She says that she made every attempt to really love him and accept him as part of the family, but it wasn't the same as his mom. And I think there are a lot of relationships between step-parents and kids that are difficult, and this one was always difficult for Kurt.
You know, I think he was so bitter about his parents being divorced that he never really, his stepmom never really had a chance from the start, I don't think. Because she seemed like a pretty nice lady to me. I always liked her. But, you know, it was hard enough on him where he just, you know, you could tell it was brutal. That made him very unhappy. There were times when he thought that he was treated unfair. You know, like his step siblings were definitely favored in some things. He thought that was going on, and you know, it's hard to say because when I stayed with them in that house, it seemed to me like everything was pretty good, you know, but I didn't have to live there.
His father just didn't, I wouldn't say take his side, but give him any benefit of the doubt. And he went with the stepchildren, which was Jay and Mindy. But he was often grounded a lot and basically paid no attention to. And then that's when he started doing his own thing. I wouldn't say he's a loner because he has friends, but he preferred being alone.
Having moved in with his new family on Fleet Street, Montesano, a small logging town about 10 miles from Aberdeen, Kurt attended Montesano High School, where he first met Darren Nethery.
It was 1975, I was 9, and when I first met Kurt at our elementary school in Montesano, and he was a very shy kid. We got to know each other basically on the playground and playing sports and things like that.
So I grew up on 3rd Street, and he moved in on Fleet Street in Montesano there. Probably around third or 4th grade, I think 3rd grade. We were around 7 years old, and I used to hang around him, go over to his house quite a bit. And he would live up, he lived upstairs, and I think his address was 413 or something like that, but he lived in the top room up there.
Kurt was kind of a free spirit, you know. He was, his kindness was always there, and you know, he could be, you know, pretty nasty at times, just, you know, when he wanted to be, and a lot of that was, his sense of humor.
We went to Seattle to watch the Mariners play. It was Little League night, and all the kids went up there, and we had a good time, stuff like that. Me and Kurt climbed when it was before batting practice, so we climbed down behind a fence and go down there. It's like 30 or 40 balls down there, and we freaking have them all this stuff, and then he threw them at the players when we were at the police. And then on Little League night, we're like 8 years old, and the usher comes up and says, "Hey, we're gonna have to throw you out,"
As far as schoolwork goes, and Kurt being academic, there's no question the guy was smart. He was very intelligent, but he didn't have a lot of drive to do well in school. He might get a C or a D in English class, but he'd get an A in art.
His artwork was just, that's all he could do, back then. He didn't like sports, like I said, and he would go home and draw. Just go to his room and draw, and later he would play, he got a set of drums.
He played the percussion, and he came to band several days a week, and we have a little band program when they first start out. He was a little blonde-haired kid with a little page boy haircut type thing, and just a regular little kid. When he played pretty good, and he showed talent in the group, and did a good job as we went through the bands. He came up from the 5th grade and the 6th grade, and came into junior high and played the music, all the different groups in the concerts in the junior high level.
We used to actually, we were going to PE class because that was right around the band room. And there was times when we'd have a little bit of free time in between classes or whatever, and we could hear, somebody playing the drums, and it was just awesome. You thought it was somebody in a rock band actually doing a demonstration. So we'd all run down to the band room and see, what was going on. Here it would be Kurt playing on the drum set, and we were just like, wow, that was really fun to see.
By the time he had reached the age of 15, the tension between Kurt and his father came to a head. Kurt opted to leave Montesano, and in the spring of 1982, he returned to Aberdeen to live with his mother. He enrolled in the sophomore year at Weatherwax High School.
I think he wanted to leave this area just because of his life here. I mean, he had to my extent, was an awful childhood. I mean, basically ignored all your life, and then the only time you're talked to is getting yelled at.
In Montesano, he was almost kind of a jock. He was a popular kid. Girls liked him. He turned out for a couple of sports. He moved to Aberdeen, and he knew hardly anyone in school, and he became a rebel. The only way he really could fit into that school was to become a stoner, and that's what he became that fall.
I met Kurt in 10th grade when I was probably 15 years old, and I'd flunked history the year before, and they said, if you don't want to retake 9th grade history, there's one option. You can take 12th grade business law. And I said, fine, I'll take 12th grade business law. And I went into the classroom, and as usual, I made my way to the very back row, to the very back corner, so no one was behind me or anything. And I looked over, and there's this other kid that I recognized, little blonde guy, sitting next to me. And I could tell he wasn't in the 12th grade. And he had Motorhead written on his peachy with all the other bands of the day, Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and such. And I said, hey, you like Motorhead? And he opened his peachy, and he had all these cutout pictures of different bands, guitar players. He had a picture of Lemmy Kilminster from Motorhead flipping off a Ronald McDonald statue. And I said, hey, that's awesome. And from then on, we hung out quite a bit. We had lots of fun together. We drank constantly. He drank. He didn't have a stomach problem then.
I saw him as bipolar. I mean, you know, he could
Up and
be
down.
creative and happy, and we were putting together a great party plan, and then other times we'd have a great party plan, but he wants nothing to do with it just for the sake of having nothing to do with it. So
he didn't like to socialize, and that's where we, like, him and Dale Krober both dropped out of school at the end of 10th grade, and I stayed in just for social reasons.
Yeah, me too.
And we'd all go to the parties, the local parties, and he didn't want to have anything to do with the rest of the rednecks around this town. And we were all like, well, there's rednecks, what the hell, you know? That's all there is.
He became a dropout, and he dropped out of school. In fact, one of the more remarkable stories I discovered in doing my book was that he then went to a school that was an alternative school set up for dropouts, and then he dropped out of the dropout school.
He was going to pretend he was mentally retarded so he could get a free high school diploma and go to the retarded class.
Yeah, I remember.
And he was sure that that would be an easy way to get through high school and not have to do anything but grunt and moan. Yeah. And it never came to fruition.
Yeah.
In April 1984, Kurt's relationship with his parents suffered another breakdown. After a colossal fight at their home in Aberdeen, Wendy told Kurt to leave the house. At just 17 years of age, Kurt became homeless, a period made famous by the Nirvana record Something in the Way.
At that point, he became sort of a kid adrift. He spent a lot of time homeless. That's the era where he talked about living under a bridge, which in my research probably was mythical. He did live a number of places in Aberdeen other than in his mother's house, but under that bridge was not something that he ever, spent many nights under there. If he did, it was one or two, not the months that he seemed to indicate in telling his own personal history.
He never lived under a bridge. It wasn't the 6th Street. There's a bridge, the bridge going out to like Lance's house, out to Bear Gulch. Right. He used to like smoke pot under there, and if he was staying out too late, he would have to wait until his stepdad left his mom's house before he could go in. So he'd wait under there, but he never lived under a bridge. That was total fiction, total bullshit.
Right.
He was too savvy. The worst place he ever lived, I think, was the back seat of Greg Hokinson's mom's Volvo. But other than that, he was a savvy homeless person. He would go wait in the waiting rooms of the hospital because there was free coffee and a color TV. You could act like you were waiting for a dying relative.
His family were around. They were never not part of his life, but he would go weeks without seeing them. His father tells stories of at one point, getting a phone call from his mother saying, I haven't seen Kurt for a couple of weeks. And his dad tells a pretty compelling story of driving around the streets of Aberdeen looking for his son, then finally finding him and taking him home for a few days. And then Kurt would be back off on his own. So there were, it wasn't exactly as if his family abandoned him. In some ways, it was more Kurt rejected every aspect of his family and he rejected them. They say, all of them, that they made attempts to keep him within the nucleus of the family. But at the same time, I also understand that it was hard to be around him. He was, at that point, very down on everything. He was very cynical, and he was abusing drugs. Basically, anything he could find, he would put into his body, and that included alcohol, it included LSD, it included methamphetamine. Kurt later claimed he took heroin during that period. My research for my book, I couldn't find a person that knew of any heroin coming through Aberdeen, but it is possible he took narcotic prescription drugs that maybe he'd ripped off from somebody's house, and he claimed that was heroin, but I don't think he was using injection drugs at that point. But he was not living a healthy lifestyle. He was putting anything in his system. He was trying to blot out and not be present. And that kind of became his life.
We were really, 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 really heavy drinkers and heavy substance abusers at really young ages, and Kurt was too.
And vandalizing.
Kurt liked to he would huff isobutane out of the bottom of Ed's shaving gel, and he'd get these horrible head rushes and almost twitch on the ground, but he kept doing it. He made this big apparatus to huff isobutane out of the bottom of Ed's shaving grid gel, and he declared himself addicted to Ed's shaving gel at one point.
After months of being shunted around between family members, Kurt was finally offered a room in the family home of his close friend Jesse Reed. A deeply religious family, Jesse's father Dave felt that the Reeds could help Kurt to rebuild his life.
Jesse Reed's dad was a Vietnam vet, okay, and they went to our church when I was young, the Reeds did, and they lived out in the country, and
Kurt lived there, and Kurt hated everybody there but Jesse.
Right.
I think at one time, Jesse's dad forced Kurt to go to Christian church, and Kurt really resented that and hated him for it.
Right.
And Jesse's dad used to be in a 60s Beach Boys clone band called the Beachcombers that still plays like the casino circuit around here.
I think it was almost like a Christian camp out at their house where they were locked in.
But I remember that
he was a brutal.
Jesse's dad had his only single he'd ever put out on vinyl, and there was one more left, and Kurt smashed it in rage one night, and said that Jesse was crying and all scared that his dad was going to find out that Kurt smashed his only 7-inch from his high school days.
Yeah, see, when you've got him with his leg all screwed up from Vietnam, it was almost like it was a weird environment. It was all about memories in the past and
his dad sold those big giant satellite dishes back in the 80s when there was no channel lock. So you could go to Jesse's house and watch like Russian TV and Chinese TV and things like that. And porno like 24 hours a day.
By June 1985, Kurt was on the move again. He and Jesse moved into their first home, an apartment in Aberdeen that was to become known as the infamous Pink Apartment.
Pink Apartment.
Well, it was just a large building. It didn't have a name, and there was a redneck guy that lived across the way. He would bitch at us for sitting in this empty apartment with absolutely no furniture and drinking and being loud all night.
Just a tape deck listening to the Bad Brains or part-time Christians over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And a lot of our friends that were, regular townies didn't like the fact that we hung around with Cobain. They thought he was crazy. And they'd say, geez, why do you... I was starting to develop an ear for punk rock at the time, just from having it repeatedly drilled into my head.
But
a lot of people didn't like him because he'd gone punk.
Well, that apartment, it was empty. And we wrote, remember the lyrics, my apartment is real bare.
A tape player and a chair.
That
was from Spam.
Refrigerators, dry and fucked. Can of process, meat product.
Yeah.
We
made a sing-along tape one night, remember?
Yeah, we were real drunk, and we wrote a lot of lyrics, and we beat on pots and pans. He did have pots and pans, but he didn't have any furniture. And,
the kitchen table came with it.
Oh, yeah.
And him and Jesse just slept in sleeping bags. We were trying to act like we had this little subculture punk scene in Aberdeen, but it wasn't really very much of... You couldn't really call it a scene.
Well, it was a scene.
It was around the Melvins completely, the only other punk band, and then everybody else who kind of wanted to start a band, but nobody ever really did.
At this point you have Kurt Cobain, who's now 17, 18 years old. He's got no job. He's got very little work experience. He's dropped out of high school. There really were not a lot of options. Remember, the unemployment rate in Aberdeen was about 15% at that point, even for people who had skills and who graduated high school. So there were not many places for him to turn. When we look at him turning towards music and rock and roll, it's not like it was a career choice. It was like, what else could he do? And so when he made that decision around the time of 18 to pursue music as a career, it really was because there were no other options open to him.
Kurt began taking music more seriously and started thinking about forming a band. A local punk rock group, the Melvins, became an important influence on Kurt, both as friends and mentors.
The Melvins were another band out of Aberdeen that actually broke out prior to Nirvana. I had heard of them first, before Nirvana ever showed up. And they had put out a slew of records, and they were unique. I mean, here was a band who had, to quote the old Frank Zappa phrase, no commercial potential. I mean, you know, they rocked, they were interesting on stage, but I don't think anybody thought that they would have a hit record, and they haven't. But what they did do was inspire a generation of younger kids under them, who, including Kurt Cobain, who was, you know, a pal of theirs down in Aberdeen.
He'd met Buzz at Montesano High School, and Buzz had shown him some fanzines like Maximum Rock and Roll and some punk things, and he really, really took a liking to it. And I remember telling him, yeah, I know Dale Crover, and he just joined this stupid new wave band called the Melvins. And he was like, no, I've seen the Melvins in Montesano, and they're a great rock and roll band. And eventually we became most die-hard Melvins fans that would have taken a bullet for any of the Melvins at any time, hauled their equipment around, and became Melvins roadies for quite some time.
This is the Melvins touring van in the early 80s, 83, 84, around that time period. And it was also the time period that Kurt was heavily influenced by the Melvins. And Kurt did this little mural of Kiss faces on the side of it to add to the various graffiti. Most of it's been washed off by years and years of sitting out in the rain and whatnot. But this one has been sort of preserved because of the integrity and the value.
I was a huge Melvins fan. Kurt, you know, we all know Kurt was really influenced by the Melvins, and for good reason. I mean, they were the heaviest thing there was. There wasn't anything heavier than the Melvins, and there probably still isn't anything heavier than the Melvins today. And when I first saw them, wow, I was just floored. I was like, God, this almost hurts. It's heavy. I like it. And Kurt was totally huge into it. And I didn't know at the time. I had no idea, actually, that the Melvins were in the Aberdeen area and stuff, and that Kurt had actually met him until, like, way later. But bands like that played a big influence.
They were one of the only bands ever from Montesano to get any attention outside that area. That was important. If they had been a R&B band, they would have had an equal influence, because the idea of any band coming from Grays Harbor and becoming successful, or at least renowned in the region, that gave Kurt the chance that it was possible for him or for any band to get some attention beyond that. I also think they played a major role artistically. The Melvins were just a pure band in what they did. They did not kowtow to what was successful. They had a vision and they stuck with it, and they're still sticking with it. But that purity of artistic form was extremely important to Kurt's own vision of himself later. So I don't think you can underestimate how, you know, seeing Buzz Osborne and Dale Crover be so serious about what they were doing and not care whether people liked him or not, that greatly affected who Kurt Cobain became as a star.
They showed these younger bands that you could not compromise your music, that you could play it as sludgy, as grungily, as loud, as nasty as you wanted, as slowly as you wanted. They came up at a time when bands were all playing really fast punk rock songs, and they slowed it way down. We're one of the first bands to do that.
Music is still really the main artistic form that youth culture in the world gravitates to. So Kurt was just like everyone else. He wanted to be a star, and he wanted to be a musician star.
As Kurt's obsession with music began to gather pace, Jesse pulled out of their shared apartment and joined the armed forces. Kurt was once again left homeless.
Kurt had become homeless from not paying his rent, and he asked me, do you think I could live at your house? And I said, you know, Paul White just got evicted from my house, and I don't think my parents are ever going to let any of my friends move in again, but you should try to hang out with my little brother and get him to ask my parents. He's never had anyone move in. There's never been any trouble. So he asked them, and they let him move in.
I think
it was supposed to be a week, and pretty soon he was pretty much a member of the family for a while.
The first time my wife and I met Kurt was about 8 o'clock in the evening, and my oldest two sons came into the living room and said, would you mind if one of our friends, Kurt, spent the night on the couch here in the living room? He's having some trouble with his father-in-law, or stepfather rather. And we said, of course, not a problem. We have had a lot of people sleep on our couches, and that's when we got to meet him for the first time. They asked if he could stay a second night, and then a third night, and then a fourth night. And after about night 6 or 7, they quit asking. We just assumed that when things got better at home, he'd go and he could stay until things did get better.
There was lots of things there. I mean, there was guitars, there was computers, and there was keyboards, there was 3-track recorders.
And then there was the Melvins practicing right down the alley, and we'd hang around there constantly.
We were somewhat puzzled that we never heard from his parents, but as long as he was easy to get along with and fit into the family, we did not really worry about him being there. He ended up staying almost a year with us. We have 5 sons and 1 daughter. And since he was with us, we expected him to do his share of the work around the house. We kept a very large rotating chore chart for lawn mowing and weed whacking and dishes and vacuuming and cleaning, etc. And Kurt was added in and went through the rotation with the rest of the family.
I think he liked it on some level. I mean, he'd bitch sometimes, but...
To belong.
Yeah, he liked the fact that... But he always did keep... I've heard a lot of people say, my dad would say, oh, his mom, he never talked to his mom never called. But that was bullshit. He'd go see his mom quite often. She always knew where he was. He just didn't want to live by their rules, but she knew where he was and things like that.
The funny thing about not wanting to live by their rules, but he was quite okay for having a chore list at your house.
I don't remember him doing chores. I've heard that. I don't remember him doing any chores.
Well, it's not necessarily he did the chores, but he was okay to be on the chore list, you know.
Well, he wanted to stay because it was like, you know, my parents were never home, or if they were, they were kind of in their own little world, and we ran the house. Right. 6 kids and 5 or 6 friends for each kid, and you cram them all in a 4-bedroom house, and it's a madhouse.
I don't think my wife and I really know the whole story of why he moved out. I know that they had been playing music. There was a disagreement between Kurt and one of my sons. They ended up fighting in the backyard.
When he left, it was a bad situation, just like for quite some time. My brother wasn't really welcome at his house, and my brother was always concerned that when we had our band, that the reason that we didn't make it, we didn't get to the big time, was that Kurt was blackballing him over the fist fight. I always thought that was kind of silly. He was probably still convinced of it to this day, that Kurt put the whammy on our band, even though we were a good band. We got good reviews and good notices. We could never hook up with the right people because Kurt told them, you know, to stay away. I didn't really believe that.
Upon leaving the Schillingers, Kurt was invited to stay with school friend and fellow member of the Aberdeen punk scene, Chris Novoselic. The pair began to play and experiment with music in a collaboration which was to become the genesis of Nirvana.
Eventually, songwriting became this way to tell his story, and that's what made music so much more compelling for him. He began to write a lot of little short stories and tales in his journals, and he began to set some of those to music around that time. I think you cannot underestimate the role of Chris Novoselic. Kurt meets him around the time he's 18, and Chris really, throughout the rest of Kurt's life, the next 9 years, becomes the one anchor that Kurt always can go back to.
Novi in high school, God, was just a one-man entertainment show.
Yeah, Novoselic was the class clown that was older.
And he was real tall.
Ran for student body vice president at one point. And I remember my sister saying, stay away from that guy. He ate rhododendrons, those flowers.
he would come out in what do you call that before a football game? And a pep assembly. And Novoselic would come out there on the basketball court and just throw together a skit, you know, just off the top of his head, and have the whole school, 600 people laughing.
But people that they always said they were outsiders, and they made themselves outsiders. Novoselic, people liked him. You could go to parties with Novoselic, and people would say, "Ah, Novi, ah."
I think
and Kurt was always welcome too, but he decided he wanted more than that, you know.
Yeah.
He decided he didn't want to. I don't know, he felt alienated, even though he wasn't really.
In September 1986, Wendy Cobain loaned Kurt $200 to move into a house with Matt Lukin from the Melvins. 1,500 East 2nd Street was quickly turned into more of a rehearsal space than a house, and it was here that Kurt and Chris' music really begun to take shape.
Chris says, you ought to come over, we're practicing or whatever. We got this band together. So we went to this little house over on the east side of Aberdeen, just little dive. I don't know if you guys got a chance to look at it. It's still there. And Matt Lukin and Kurt were living together. Well, I knew Matt from the Melvins from before. And so anyway, we wandered on in, and it was pretty scary, borrowed equipment.
It was behind the Thriftway on B Street in Aberdeen, and it was a horrible little house, but he was really proud of it. I remember that he was really hurt because he showed it to his mom, who didn't live that far away at the time, and she said that she didn't like the idea of her son living in a rundown nigger shack. And it really hurt his feelings because he was really proud. This was his house, you know. He was very possessive of it. My house, you know, it's not a crummy apartment, it's a house, and it was like a little 2-bedroom thing that he lived with Luke in.
Probably should have been bulldozed at the time. It really wasn't technically inhabitable. But they lived there anyway, and Kurt rarely worked and had little money, and so before too long we got to be friends and whatnot, and I worked, and I was comfortable, and I would cook and eat well, and so I'd invite him over for dinner, and of course then we'd talk more about music, and he ended up being a tremendous influence on me, music-wise, and of course I was interested. I've always had a passion for music. So my relationship with the band just grew tighter and tighter and tighter in the sense that I was an enthusiast. I appreciated their music. I desperately desired this sort of cultural information from them, and was a volunteer, you know, a patron, where if they needed something, I was more than willing to, you know, volunteer. And that's really what the relationship later, as things began to be more productive, is, you know, it wasn't that I was ever asked formally to do anything for them. I just volunteered.
As the fledgling band started to gather an original repertoire, Ryan Aigner, a friend of Cobain and fan of the music, managed to secure a gig in Raymond, a small town south of Aberdeen. In March 1987, Nirvana embarked on their first and possibly most infamous performance.
The band plays their very first show at this kegger in Raymond, Washington. Pretty amazing event. I went and sat in the house they played in and managed to pull together a handful of people who were at that show to describe it to me, and it was a pretty remarkable event.
Ryan came over,
yeah,
and he would always come over here and we'd be playing and jamming and stuff, and he said he was managing that band at the time. I'm assuming he was, and he said, you got to hear these guys are really good, and he said, well, bring them on over, you know, on some weekend. I can't remember what the exact date is.
Yeah.
I think it was what?
It was March of '87.
It was like March of '87.
There's just some teenagers that, well, they're not teenagers, they're 20-something crowd guys that lived in this house, and every Friday and Saturday night was a party anyway. And whether the band played or the stereo played was no big deal to them. They didn't have outsiders coming in. It was a tight social circle again. There were the band dudes, and there were the groupie dudes, and then all our girlfriends and whatnot. So then this one Saturday, I had made these arrangements to to bring these guys down. Well, it was the same problem with Nirvana. You know, they didn't, well, they weren't called Nirvana then, but, you know, they'd just been rehearsing in this house. They hadn't done anywhere, gone anywhere, done anything. And I made this suggestion, maybe we should try something, go see what, you know, public reaction would be like. Well, the minute I even, you know, discussed it with Kurt, he was like, Raymond, that's going the wrong way, dude. You know, we don't want to go down into, you know, the interior. You know, we want to go to the city, get out of the swamp. But he agreed to go. And so we get there and we kind of socialize for a while, and he played. And from the very beginning, you know, it wasn't. He didn't put on a special performance for them. If you run the reel forward and look at the sort of classic Nirvana performance, it was all there, everything. Same thing he did that night was same show he put on 4 or 5 years later, and but those people were watching a show that you know, they were used to entertainers. When the guitar turned on, this very introverted sort of person took an incredible amount of intensity, which you know, if you were close to him at all and you talked to him, you'd know this. But just to see him physically, he wasn't particularly animated or whatever. But when that guitar came on, the energy, he started to push out through the speaker. You know, he wasn't an animated performer either, but he terrorized the sound waves that night. Well, these people were they listened to classic rock, you know, and this guy was just feedback Blue Cheer style. I mean, just woo, going on and on and on and on and on, and then finally break into these songs. Well, and it weren't that they were bad songs; they were performed badly at all. They were new.
It was definitely different. I think that the whole crowd here was really mixed. Mm-hmm. You know, either you were open to hearing something new, or you just weren't at all. And they're not Metallica, and they need to get out of here.
Yeah, they need to start playing some AC/DC.
It was really, I think, down the middle.
And I think after, you know, when Jeff and I and everybody listened to the tape, then you kind of start to appreciate it more the more you'd listen to it.
There's a tape that exists of it, and no one even knew what their name was at that point. They didn't have a name. It was just like, oh, there's a band playing. And it wasn't particularly a great show by any description, but it still gave Kurt a sense that he could be a star. It gave him a sense that he could get that attention. As I write in Heavier Than Heaven, he found something that was very powerful. It was the narcotic of attention, which in some ways was actually more powerful to Kurt Cobain than drugs themselves. He loved being the center of attention, and you know, that from then on, he was sold.
You know, the beginning of Nirvana was a shaky ordeal for everybody involved, and like I said before, you know, if you look at as the analogy of the great plane taking off, that what it would turn into, it didn't even look like it was going to get off the ground there at first.
In April 1987, Kurt finally left Aberdeen to live with his first girlfriend, Tracy Miranda, in the lively college town of Olympia.
Well, I think Kurt had to leave Aberdeen at some point, and Olympia was kind of a compromise. Seattle, he thought, was too big and scary. He went and looked at an apartment in Tacoma and then was afraid he was going to get shot. He decided to move to Olympia. It was the closest arty community. Olympia had a college. It had an active music scene, but even when we use the word scene, we're probably overstating it. There were a handful of punk rock shows every other week. There were a couple of clubs. Cobain wasn't old enough to go to those clubs. There was one all-ages club that happened around that time that did give him a forum to play. So there were things happening, and Olympia became his home. It was probably the place he loved more than any place else, certainly artistically. What was most important about Olympia is he got exposed to a number of intellectuals. There were a lot of people who were going to Evergreen, the college there, who were very bright, and they became Kurt's friends, or if not his friends, they became people he got exposed to, from Slim Moon to Calvin Johnson to Toby Vale to Kathleen Hanna. There were a number of people in that world that were extremely bright people, and they encouraged Kurt, I think, to up the level of what he was doing.
I had these two good friends. Well, actually, Dylan Carlson and I had these two good friends, Tam Ormond and Tracy Mirander, and I had known Tracy for quite a while because she was part of our group who went to a lot of Melvin shows. And Tam and Tracy were really the first people from Olympia who decided that Kurt was something special. And they started driving to Aberdeen whenever they had time off work, because both of them had decided that he was going to be their next boyfriend. And they were basically in cahoots, working as a pair, but one of them was going to get him.
Some friends of mine and I got to Aberdeen and hang out with the Melvins, and got to, Buzz was still living with his parents, but we'd go to his house and hang out sometimes, or go to some parties. And then eventually Kurt and Matt Lukin and I can't remember who else, they shared a house together. And then Matt moved out, and Kurt was just ended up living there by himself, but Nirvana used to practice there and play there, and there always be parties there and whatnot. And then eventually he got kicked out, or was getting evicted because he wasn't paying the rent. At some point during that 6-month period, Kurt and I started dating, and dated for several months before he was getting evicted from his house. Then he decided to move to Olympia with me. I think part of the reason Kurt liked Olympia was that there's a lot of different styles meshing at the same time, a lot of music going on. It was certainly more low-key than Seattle as far as going to shows. People didn't, dress up as much or put on as much makeup or wear the so-called right clothes to go to shows. But there's a lot of do-it-yourself attitude. K Records was going along pretty good at the time, and people were more willing to put on their own shows, make their own flyers, just do a lot of the work by themselves. And there's just a lot of different types of music playing in Olympia at that time.
Well, Kurt moved to Olympia when he was 19, and the most important person in that milieu was Tracy Mirander. He hooked up with, finally, his first real girlfriend, and a woman who really played a major role in sort of keeping it together for him. She was both his girlfriend and somewhat of a mother figure at times to him. I mean, she paid his bills, she fed him, she cleaned their house, and she also, which I don't think she gets much credit for, she's quite a bright and very well-rounded person. She was very interested in music. And in fact, when she and Cobain first met, her background in music and her awareness of records was far greater than his. So I think she almost played a role of a Svengali in terms of making him aware of, hey, Kurt, listen to this, open your parameters up. And she was very into punk rock, went to a lot of shows, and then additionally she was very popular. People really liked Tracy, and so she became kind of the better half of the couple. And consequently, a number of people who I talked to who went and saw those early shows when Nirvana was called Bliss, they went only because they knew Tracy. They said it's Tracy's boyfriend's band is what Nirvana was first known as. And so Tracy played a huge role in the early history of this band, and ultimately, I think, in their success.
Well, I tried to be very supportive. It was hard at times because for the first 6 months or so we lived together, he did have a job and worked and contributed to the income and cleaning the house. And then eventually he couldn't really pay the rent except for when they got money from shows, but a lot of the money they got at that time went back into band equipment because he didn't have a lot of money. They didn't get paid very much. And then he stopped cleaning, and that was kind of a contention. We'd fight quite a bit over that because I was working 50 or 60 hours a week, earning just a little over minimum wage, to support us and everything. But other than that, I try to be real supportive of him and help him out because his music was real important to him, and I really, I liked Nirvana a lot, and I wanted them to be successful.
Kurt's art began to blossom with Tracy's support. He would spend hours painting at their house in Olympia, and the band practiced with increasing frequency. Kurt's style and songwriting developed considerably, aided by the influence of the Olympia art scene.
He would like to go to parties, but he'd be really shy. He was really a pretty shy guy, and he'd occasionally be the wildest, weirdest guy at the party and do something totally bizarre. But most of the time, he'd actually just be in a corner somewhere, quietly watching everything and occasionally making a wry comment. But you never knew when he was going to suddenly just do something absolutely hilarious. And it was never drunken.
Kurt was shy to a certain extent. Like I think he had to push himself to go and then actually introduce himself to people or act not shy, but he could pull it off really well. Like he could be shy and nervous but not show it when he was dealing with people. And I think he just had a hard time in general dealing with people that were more normal. Like he had a really hard time with rednecks. When he worked as a janitor for a while, he had to work with a couple of rednecks at night, and they'd make jokes about women or the minorities, and he just had a hard time not saying anything in response, but also not going along with it either. And I think that was hard for him in dealing with people sometimes. I guess the relationship was like anyone else's. It had its ups and downs. You know, we fought sometimes, but we also got along really well together and had a lot of fun. He liked, because before he liked to cook around the house. He loved to hang out with the cats and the pet rats and the birds, and just not just to look at, but just to pet as well and feed. We never really went camping, but he did like to go out in the woods and nature and go for walks and be outside. He liked the fact we had a little backyard he could hang out in.
Well, one thing about Kurt is that he was definitely obsessed with music. I mean, like us all, like the group of friends that we hung out with, obsession with music was the thing that we had in common. And he was always buying new records, going out to see new bands, talking about, reading books about the lives of bands, and talking about music all the time. And that's really what we had in common. And he'd stay up all night making collages of bits of songs and spoken word records and joke records and things, and make these montages of soundscapes, sort of like the audio version of a collage, and record tons of songs on his 4-track, and he was just hungry for music.
Kurt was very artistic, and when we lived together, he used to do quite a bit of art. We'd sometimes buy canvases together, or he'd buy a lot of paints. He liked to paint a lot, and he did the kind of the oil pastels, drawings and whatnot. And if he didn't have enough money to buy a canvas at the time, we would go to thrift stores and he would buy board games and just paint it on the back of a board game and do that. And a lot of his paintings, when I look at them now, they seem kind of dark, but I don't think he doesn't seem to have the dark attitude when he's painting them. He practiced a lot. I mean, I've known the people that only practice when the bands get together to play, but he'd play guitar all the time at home, just kind of fiddling around with stuff. And I thought he was a really good guitar player, and I think he was really good on stage and look at the audience and draw people's attention, but a lot of people didn't know too that he would throw up before almost every show. Like he'd swear he wasn't nervous, but then he would get sick. I can't really remember how often they played in the early days. I know at first it was, they play a show, it might be a few weeks or a month before they played another one, but then eventually they got to do more and more opening, acts. But he was always, would get kind of frustrated because people in Seattle didn't really get to a show until 10:30 or 11, and a lot of the places expected you to play at like 9 o'clock, 9:30, and so he'd get frustrated that there's only, 5, 10, 20 people in the audience. But as they played more and more often and they practiced at Chris and Shelley's house in Tacoma, they got better and better, and they got a little bit more tighter. Of course, quite often 1 or 2 or 3 of them would be drunk when they played, but then they smash instruments sometimes, and that always, like, the crowd liked that. Everyone enjoyed it. It's a good time.
It was also about the time that Nirvana played at Chaos. That's the little college radio there at Evergreen State College in Olympia. That show was important because a lot of bootlegs were made. It was virtually the first recorded Nirvana ever made.
In the hope of securing a gig for the band, Tracy handed a tape of the Chaos Show to Jim May, manager of the Tacoma Community World Theatre.
I saw Kurt play a show at the Tacoma World Theatre when they were called Bliss, and he was wearing these, like, I think they're like this almost sparkle purple, like 70s like flare velvet crushed pants or something. They were pretty outlandish, and Dave, I think, was still drumming for him at the time, and it was pretty loud. It was a pretty good show, actually.
The thing that I remembered the most, or that I noticed the most, was actually that all of his guitar solos really involved squatting on the floor and turning his digital delay back and forth, so it'd just be a lot of noise, and then he'd go back to playing the song. But he was I think it was some sort of punk statement, you know, I'm not going to play any guitar solos. So the songs were structured like there was a verse, there was a chorus, there's a verse, there's a chorus, there's a bridge where you would have the guitar solo, but the bridge always just had him playing with his effects boxes, and then back to the verse and the chorus.
What attracted people to Nirvana at first was his performance skill. I mean, he was mesmerizing on stage. That really was what drew people in, not his technical prowess in any regard. And then secondly, his songs. He started to write songs that were powerful. That really was the key, and I think what made Kurt, you know, what I would call a genius in music was his ability to write songs.
Having had considerable success on the live circuit, Kurt and the band felt that the time was right to record a demo. On the 23rd of January 1988, Nirvana recorded a session with up-and-coming producer Jack Endino at Reciprocal Studios in Seattle. Faced with the absence of a drummer, the band asked Dale Crover of the Melvins to fill in.
In early January of 1988, I just got a phone call from a guy named Kurt from Aberdeen who said he was a friend of the Melvins and he wanted to come up and record, and he would have Dale from the Melvins playing drums with him. And since I held Dale's drumming in very high regard, I said, well, that sounds like fun. Let's do that. How about next Saturday or whatever we ended up doing. So, yeah, I said, yeah, come on up, let's do it. How much money do you want to spend? How much time do you want to book? And he said, well, we've only got, a few $100s. We just have time for one afternoon, and we're just going to record some songs and just mix them right on the spot as fast as we can. And, you make a tape, get some shows with it or whatever. And he said, well, we don't really have a name yet. We're still looking for a permanent drummer. I said, well, whatever, come on up. So, and that led to the first Nirvana studio session, which was January 23rd of 1988.
I'm not really sure how it came about. I'm not sure if Kurt paid for those or who, but I had some recording time set up. They went up. Jack was the guy. We knew Jack because he was in Skin Yard. We see him periodically, pretty low-key guy. All those guys, they worked at a place called Reciprocal.
I thought they were really good. It really appealed to me. I thought, Dale's an amazing drummer, of course, and so that was a real pleasure for me to record him and watch him playing, because drummers in this town always idolized him and said, oh my God, he's just a very creative, skilled drummer, very interesting guy to watch, always interesting to see what he plays. And he worked very well with them. But entirely aside from Dale as a drummer, it seemed like, Chris and Kurt had this sort of chemistry going where they just complemented each other very well. It just seemed like a very strong, if young band. And something about Kurt's voice really appealed to me. I thought he had a very good rock scream.
He had a just tremendous voice. He was a great singer. And that's not something somebody learns or that he was born with it. I mean, you hear that voice singing these songs, and the combination of the emotional tone of his voice and the words he was singing, it just adds up to something that just always draws me in.
They were pretty professional about it in the sense that they were able to record 10 songs and finish them in less than 5 hours. I think I billed 5 hours of studio time. They were probably there about 6 or 6.5 hours. We allow for setup. So, I mean, they were pretty well rehearsed, and, they didn't screw around, in other words. They knew they only had, $150 or something to record with, and they didn't waste any time. So I thought they were efficient. They knew what they wanted. And
I was really impressed when they did that Indino demo.
Well,
I remember they played a show that night after they did it, and they were playing a mixed version of it through the PA, and it sounded so good, and I was blown away.
When they put out the demo tape that they made before they got signed to Sub Pop, he sent the tape to a lot of different record companies of bands that he really liked, like Scratch Ass's record company and Black Flag's record company, SST Records and stuff. And he was really sad when he didn't get response from any of them, or some no response. Some said, sorry, we're not interested. But he was pretty excited when they got on Sub Pop.
Jack Endino passed a mixed version of the Nirvana demo to Jonathan Poneman, co-owner of the underground Seattle label Sub Pop.
they actually left the tape at the studio for a while with the idea that, oh, maybe we'll come back and do some more work on the tape later when we get some money. And I said, well, do you mind if I give your tape to some people? Because I thought it was really good. And I thought some friends of mine would really enjoy hearing this. So, you know, they said, oh, fine, because we're just going to give cassettes out to people, too. We need to, you know, we want people to know about us. So I gave some tapes to people, and one of them got to John Poneman at Sub Pop.
Sub Pop then decided to start signing the newest crop of local bands, and they found all these bands like Soundgarden, Green River, Mudhoney, and Nirvana showed up in town, and they signed them too. This was a real breakthrough, not only for those bands, but really for the whole scene. Suddenly you had the coolest new bands, all on one label, all being marketed in the same way with the same look, the same photography, the same style of photography on their record jackets. And it was a brilliant stroke by the guys behind Sub Pop Records to push this movement, this scene. They weren't just hoping on one song by one band like a lot of labels will put all their eggs in one basket and go, boy, this is the song, let's make it or break it on this one song. They said, no, let's push this concept of the scene and the sound and the look, and boy, were they lucky to find Cobain and Nirvana, because that was the real breakthrough for them too.
After going to see the band perform live, Poneman decided that Sub Pop should release Nirvana's first single.
You know, Nirvana had 6 drummers over the course of their career, and they all had their strengths. Aaron was a powerful drummer, but you know, he wasn't exactly a punk rock drummer. He was more of a hard rock drummer. So eventually he had some personal issues, and they switched. And the first real drummer that stuck with them for a while was Chad Channing.
I got involved with it because, one, I liked what they were doing. I mean, there was something, I could tell there was something, you know, kind of special going on, you know, because when they gave me their demo tape that they did with Dale, and I was like, wow, this stuff's really cool. And one thing in particular that I especially like in music that I hear is relation with vocal melody lines over guitar, you know. I've never been so much as in, well, let's get all this great music together and then try to throw some vocals over it, you know. I'm really big into more of the melody line than anything else. And the way he kind of mixed everything up, you know, I was like, okay, there's some good talent here. You know, this is actually really cool stuff, you know, totally different. And that's what drew me into it. And so when I was jamming with them, you know, getting used to their songs and stuff like that, it was just like, I was just like, wow, this is cool, this is fun. You know, even though nobody said, okay, you're in the band, it was just kind of like, we just kept on having fun. And the fun rolled on, I guess.
Chad was very close to Kurt. I mean, these the early genesis of this band, I mean, these people were as close as brothers. They traveled the country together in a van. You know, they did 7 tours before Nirvana really broke. So, you know, this band, the sort of core of Channing, Novoselic, and Cobain, they were extremely close.
It was really good, I think, in a way that, especially in the beginning, because I'm a lot like him in the respects, like, pretty quiet, pretty shy myself, you know, especially when, like, meeting other people. I'm not a very forward type of human being. So, you know, a lot of it was very kind of warming up to each other. I think it probably took a while, because it was like, well, this guy doesn't seem to talk much, he's really, really quiet. And I'm thinking, well, Kurt doesn't seem to talk much and he's really quiet. So we got this kind of thing going on. But eventually, you know, those things kind of drop and stuff. And our relationship was really, really pretty fun. I always thought, you know, because we never got in each other's skins because we were always too quiet.
With Channing attached, Nirvana arranged to go back into the studio with Jack Endino. It was decided that Love Buzz, the band's most commercial song, should become the A-side of the single.
John Poneman at Sub Pop decided that he wanted to do a 7-inch with the band. And by then they had Chad Channing as a drummer. So the next recording session I had with them was in June of 1988, when we did the Love Buzz 7-inch and a couple of other songs, which later ended up on the Bleach album.
First show we had, Sub Pop had put the show on for us. And it was in Seattle at the Central Tavern. There were all but 12 people there, and I think that included Bruce and Jonathan from Sub Pop. And you know, we just kind of walked in, set up. It was kind of strange because I don't think there were any other bands playing. And we just kind of set up our gear and just, you know, powered through the set. And you know, a lot of the people that were there, you know, were like, you know, at the bar already, and they were drinking and stuff. And so there wasn't really much in the way of response or anything. But you know, of course, Bruce and Jonathan came out and said, "Yeah, that was a great show. You know, it was really cool."
The band was a bit chaotic on stage, as were a lot of bands, and but they weren't chaotic like, you know, like the Clash or the Sex Pistols or something running all over the stage madly. They were disorganized. They were a lot of time went between songs. They weren't running a tight ship, and you know, a lot of bands play that way. But you know, later on they firmed everything up. They got a better show together.
We're probably the early days when we first went out on tour on our first single, because we didn't know what to expect. We actually asked Sub Pop was like, we want to go on tour, you know, even though we have this single, you know, we want to go on tour and set something up. We want to play around. And it wasn't like, okay, you guys are, you know, if you're ready to do a tour, we'll set this up for you. It was the opposite. We asked them. And so, okay, they're like, sure, they set it up. And so, and that made the tour very kind of, you know, touch and go. You know, like, you know, like, we, you know, hopefully make about $50 to, you know, get down to the next venue. And a lot of the times we'd stay at, you know, like rest stop areas or camping or stuff like that. So, like, on the road was kind of like, you know, that was sort of, we were like family on the road. You know, it's like there was no one else but us in that little white pill we called a van. I think around the time when I think Kurt and stuff, and we felt like we were getting big, probably, I mean, since we'd first heard ourselves on the radio.
And when the first single came out, KCMU had it, the college radio station, and I remember we had pulled over at a gas station in Seattle, and on our way home from Seattle, and he stopped to call the radio station to request the song so he could hear it on the radio in the car. And then he was just tickled pink, and he had the biggest smile on his face the whole time it was on.
Love Buzz was a huge underground success, and Sub Pop quickly sold their initial run of 1,000 copies. Kurt desperately wanted to record an album, but Poneman felt that the next step for the band should be an EP. A compromise was reached when Nirvana agreed to pay for the studio time to record Bleach, which Sub Pop promised to release as an LP.
They basically called me and said, well, we've got about $600 that somebody's going to loan us. We want to do the album ourselves. And Sub Pop wants to do an EP, but we want to do an album, so we just want to pay for it ourselves and then see what happens. Well, maybe Sub Pop will do it. Maybe we'll get someone else to do it. So I said, okay, we'll have to work really fast. That only gives us a few days of recording time. So we broke it up into chunks. We'd do like 3 or 4 hours at a time and work as hard as we could, and then they'd go home, and then they'd come back, and we'd do a few evenings. And that's how we ended up working over the holidays at the end of 1988. Nobody else wanted that particular studio time. So it was ultimately Sub Pop, who still wanted to do an EP. Nirvana wanted to do an LP, a full LP, and they managed to talk them into it. They decided finally to go with Sub Pop, if Sub Pop would do the full album. Bleach is literally 1 guitar track, 1 bass track, 1 drum performance, and 1 vocal performance, and sometimes a little bit of guitar overdubbed or a little backing vocals overdubbed. But that's the record. It's basically how they played it. I just pressed record. And of course, by my choice of which mics to use and how to record it and how to EQ it, of course, I was sculpting the sound to that extent and, helping be a critical ear and giving them, critical feedback. But by and large, arrangements didn't change. Anything that I would, there's a reason why it doesn't say produced by Jack and Dino on the record. Because really, I just engineered it. I mean, it was sort of produced by everybody. Or perhaps produced by nobody. It sounds like the band sounded at the time. It's a pretty faithful representation of Nirvana at that exact point in time. I mean, that is really what their music sounded like. Most of the new songs they had written with Chad Channing on the drums had a different feel than the songs they were doing that they'd been doing with Dale. The songs they'd been doing with Dale were a little more Melvin-y, a little heavier, and the stuff they were working up with Chad was still sort of that 70s kind of riff rock, but it was becoming a little more, the vocal melodies were becoming a little more thought out. And that was the one thing that struck me about them, was his particular ear for melody. He would have these strange guitar riffs, but then he would have a vocal melody that was completely different. For instance, About a Girl, which was sort of the odd tune on Bleach. Because most of Bleach is what I would call riff rock. It's like Deep Purple or Budgie or something like that. It's basically heavy riffing, and it's sort of classic riff rock, almost heavy metal, but not quite. And About a Girl was kind of the odd song because it's sort of the melodic pop tune, if you will, and it sort of stuck out. And Kurt said, I don't know if people will be ready for this song, but I really want to do one pop song on this record. And I said, hey, I'm just the engineer here, whatever, I'll make it sound good. You go ahead.
Sub Pop arranged a US tour to promote the album, and with Bleach quickly becoming an underground hit, Nirvana finally started to play sellout dates.
The second time we went on the road in the States, and Bleach was out, we noticed a significant difference in the people that showed up at the venues and stuff. Just everywhere we were playing, was being packed. And we were thinking, wow, this is really cool. And of course, there was a big difference too in the money we were making. The first time we went out, we'd be praying to make at least $50 so we can put gas in the tank and maybe a sandwich or two from a 7-Eleven to get us to the next venue. But second time around during the Bleach, we realized things were changing. We had much better guarantees. We weren't worrying about gas or having to buy sandwiches at the 7-Eleven. None of that was a problem. And we also had we were doing radio interviews from time to time. We played this show called Lane Fest at the Moore Theater in Seattle, down 2nd Virginia. and we packed the place, and it was I can't remember the bill. There was a lot of, it was Mudhoney and us, Tad. I can't remember the rest of the bands, but it was the first time I actually played, the Moore Theater, a big place that seated more than just, max capacity of 250 people. It was big.
In late 1989, Nirvana began their first European tour, an attempt to capitalise on the success of Bleach in the UK. The tour followed a frenetic schedule of 37 shows in 42 days, and Kurt's behaviour became increasingly erratic as the strain of growing success began to show. Kurt would often sink into depressed moods during the tour and started to talk about moving back into his mother's house in Aberdeen.
At least in my mind, when growing up, I always pictured, wow, that's when bands really get big, like when Europe asks you to come over and play for them, and it's like, wow, that's a cool thing. And but we really enjoyed that whole deal, and I think with those shows, we knew that things were really starting to happen for Nirvana.
He actually seemed very happy with how things went from the time they recorded their first demo and sent it to record labels and getting a record deal and making the record and going on tour a bunch of times and making an EP. Through that whole process, he never really griped or groused or seemed to feel that he wanted to go further or that it wasn't what he had expected. So, he already seemed happy when he wasn't a rock star. He just seemed happy to have a music career.
In 1991, with Chad Channing replaced by drummer Dave Grohl, Nirvana released their second studio album, Nevermind. Nevermind launched Nirvana as a global phenomenon and pushed Kurt into the responsibilities of adulthood and fame. Over the years that followed, the transition from shy, small-town artist to international rock icon proved ultimately to be a leap that Kurt could not make.
I don't know how much he ever enjoyed things. He found fun, but enjoyment, that's a difficult question to put to the issue of Kurt Cobain.
Because Kurt had never indicated any desire to be a star. And so I'd never even thought about, does he have the talent to be a big star? Because it takes more than just the talent. It takes the desire, and you have to make a series of decisions that put you in the position to become a big star. And I actually never expected him to make those decisions. It was kind of a surprise when they made a pretty commercial record.
I think he enjoyed his success in the fact that he felt validated, that finally he proved himself that he wasn't a loser from Aberdeen, high school dropout, that he was successful at what he did. But I think it was hard for him to be as famous as he was, where he couldn't go anywhere without being recognized and having just the minutest detail written about him, anything that happened.
He once mentioned one time that some of the best times that Kurt ever had were back in the old days, when we were just traveling around in our van and hoping to scrape up enough to get to the next show, and that things for Kurt just got tougher and tougher, and I think just the overall stress and demand that's put on you once you're picked up by a major label and all of a sudden you find out that so much of your life you've got so little control of. Because it's all, it's kind of a big money machine, and all of a sudden you've turned into a chess piece. And I can't ever imagine Kurt being happy, as a pawn in anything or anybody's game. And I truly don't think he was. And I don't think he really enjoyed I don't think he was the kind of person to enjoy the kind of success that he had. I don't think he wasn't, built or made for that. Personally, I think he should have just called it quits and moved down to Mexico and lived the rest of his life in solitude or whatever, But as we all know, nothing like that transpired.
This note should be pretty easy to understand. All the warnings from the Punk Rock 101. Curses over the years since my first introduction to the, shall we say, ethics involved with independence and the embracement of your community has proven to be very true. I haven't felt the excitement of listening to as well as creating music, along with really writing something for too many years now. I feel guilty beyond words about these things. For example, when we're backstage and the lights go out and the manic roar of the crowd begins, it doesn't affect me the way in which it did for Freddie Mercury, who seemed to love and relish in the love and adoration from the crowd. Well, Kurt, so fucking what? Then don't be a rock star, you asshole. Which is something I totally admire and envy. The fact is, I can't fool you, any one of you. It simply isn't fair to you or to me. The worst crime I can think of would be to pull people off by faking it, pretending as if I'm having 100% fun. No, Kurt, the worst crime I can think of is for you to just continue being a rock star when you fucking hate it and just fucking stop.